Hello, welcome to the Sports Philanthropy Podcast. I am your host, Roy Kessel, and today we are very excited to have with us Mary Morten. Mary is the founder and the president of Morten Group, which handles nonprofit consulting, and she also does some very other interesting work in film. And Mary, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you so much, Roy. Good to be here.
We're excited to have you with us. I know you've got an incredible background working in this space with nonprofits. Our network has a lot of organizations of all different shapes and sizes, and they really frequently look for guidance and information on how to improve and strengthen their organizations. And so before we spend more time diving into those types of issues, give us a little bit of your background and how you got drawn into this world.
Sure. Where I am a lifelong Chicagoan, and which is hard to believe. Many people can't believe that I went to college here and everything, went to Loyola University, but I really started in association management in Chicago, did that for a number of years, and then made a switch into nonprofit work. And then 19 years ago, we actually started Morten Group, which is hard to believe. It's been 19 years ago. And we do work with nonprofits primarily and foundations, but we also work with for-profits as well. And we work in 4 areas. We work in the area of organizational development, which is that umbrella, which includes everything from board development, how one really moves into the role of a board member, the roles and responsibilities of board members, fundraising for boards, fundraising for staff. So a lot of resource development work, whether it's a development audit or working on a feasibility study, which we're doing right now for an environmental company. So executive coaching, all that under the umbrella, if you will, of organizational development. And then we also do a lot of work in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space. Or DEI, as it is often referenced. And we do assessments, and we do workshops, and we do full operational integration of these values and principles into your work of your organization. And we've done that in foundations, we've done it in nonprofits, but again, really always starting with an assessment. We feel as though we can't go in and just prescribe what is needed for an organization. We need to actually assess them, which is done generally through surveys, interviews, maybe focus groups. We write a very in-depth report for the organization. And then we really take that assessment and tailor the workshops or trainings for the organization. And after that, we help them really think about how they're going to work this into the operations of the organization, both with staff and in some cases board members as well. And then the last area, or last 2 areas I think I want to mention, are research. So we do a lot of research. It could be a research project with the University of Chicago on a National Institutes of Health Research, or NIH, or it could be the research that we do whenever we conduct an assessment. So as I said, we always conduct an assessment before we do any DEI work. The last area is executive searches. And so we have a number of executive searches. We primarily do executive searches for what would be referred to as C-suite or executive level staff in an organization. And again, we've done that in foundations, and we've done it also in nonprofits as well. And so that is really the breadth of our work, if you will. We are we're headquartered in Chicago, but we work across the country and are working with clients in New York and in Pacific Northwest, San Francisco. We're kind of all over in many ways, but it's a lot of fun. And I really like the fact that no 2 days are the same.
Well, I know it's probably like trying to ask you to choose one of your favorite friends, but you described 4 areas. Which of those areas do you find that you spend your most time on, and also which do you enjoy the most?
Well, I actually enjoy different pieces of all of them. However, I would say we spend the most time in what I've really just loved so much is probably 2 areas. I would say it's the diversity, equity, and inclusion work. And then I would also say executive searches, because I think they're fascinating to really observe how people and the client partners that we have really come together, and we help them make a match, if you will. The diversity, equity, and inclusion work is very important to me personally. And we've seen a major increase in that work, actually probably since 2016. And so that is important to, I think, all of us on our team from a personal standpoint, because we think all of our work really helps the world be a better place. But we think that in particular in this work, when we're talking to people about how your organization can be more inclusive, more diverse, and more equitable.
And those are great aspirations for every organization. And it's interesting because we did a recent webinar that was a town hall meeting on adaptive sports, and that was one of the big areas that came up, was how few of the sports organizations really have significant integration with servicing fans with disabilities, number one,
Mm-hmm,
but
mm-hmm,
also in terms of supporting sports opportunities and athletic opportunities for individuals with physical disabilities.
mm-hmm, absolutely.
Obviously, the Special Olympics does great for developmentally disabled individuals and gives an incredible number of opportunities. But the feeling in the adaptive sports world is that the larger organizations and leagues have really lagged in their participation in that space.
Mm-hmm,
We know, in addition to that market, that there's really a terrible track record in most sports organizations, both
right.
in terms of race and gender. Um,
Absolutely.
and, certainly now with, with gender identity and things like that coming up, there's a
Mm-hmm,
lot of other issues there. Um,
absolutely.
and that's always one of the things that I think is interesting, because I think aspirationally, when you go and talk to these organizations, they'll tell you, yes, either we are diverse or we want to be diverse. But when you do your assessment, tell us what that looks like in terms of how you make that evaluation.
Well, when we do the assessment, we do interviews with people that can really speak to the organization's work, and we make it very clear that we want to speak to people across all levels of the organization. So it's not enough to say, oh, we're going to let you talk to the management team or the executive management team. We want to speak to the folks who are on your administrative team. We understand that the person who may answer the phone or greet someone at the door sees the organization in a very, very different way, and is treated, frankly, in a very different way than people are in management positions. And so we want to have all those perspectives in any kind of assessment. So we make it really clear when we're partnering with an organization that those are we want to really be very broad in who we speak with. Everyone gets a survey, but we also want to be able to interview. We interview a smaller group of people, but we want to make sure that we're interviewing people, again, from every area of the organization. That's very important to us. And after we gather that data, we analyze it, look for the themes that we can determine, and then we write the report, essentially giving back what we've learned, but we do it in a way that is anonymous. So the information is de-identified, so that people cannot necessarily go back to someone and be able to determine who said it. And we take particular care depending on the size of the organization. If you work in a small organization and someone is making a point they've made many times, since we use sample quotes, but we have de-identified them, someone may be able to figure that out. And so we really do look at whether or not we can use sample quotes, or if we're just going to lift up the themes that we're hearing. The reports are very accessible, and they are what we use, as I said, to really design the training. So while there are different components of trainings that we think are important for all trainings, we really try to figure out what the detail will be for a particular client partner. How will we customize that training? Are there other concerns around gender equity, or is it more around racial equity? Is it around ableism, as you've talked about, something that we have not done a great job on across most of our communities in terms of really lifting up people who have differences around physical abilities. And so it really depends on what the assessment tells us. And then that's how we develop the trainings. The trainings can be anywhere from usually 3 hours to maybe 7 hours. We can do things for an entire weekend. We can do things as part of an in-service. However, we really want to make sure we're managing expectations with our client partners in terms of how much we can cover. These are very important and difficult conversations for people to have. And we know it's important to give people enough space to have these conversations. And so that is something that we are always weighing in terms of, are we covering the appropriate material, and are we covering the appropriate amount of material? Most often when things are going as you might like in a session like this, people will say, I wish we had more time. Because people, once they have a space created to have these conversations, something that, by the way, many people cannot do, but they have a facilitated space, they feel that it is both a safe and brave space, and I'll tell you what we mean by that, and then they participate. And when we say safe and brave, people often talk about, oh, let's create a safe space, right? And that's a space where everyone's gonna feel comfortable. What we know is, particularly in doing diversity, equity, and inclusion work, is that you must also feel brave. Feeling safe means that I get to sit here maybe with my hands folded and not really venture outside myself, not really disclose, not really ask questions. If I am feeling brave, then I am going to ask a question that maybe I think, is someone going to make fun of me for asking this question? And the answer in our sessions would be no. We want to make sure that you feel comfortable asking those questions and really getting involved with the material, understanding the material, talking to your colleagues about it. So you have to be brave, right? So it's, yes, we're going to create a space where you can do that, but it's really about being brave and being ready to, make that move outside of our comfort zone. In this work in particular, if there is no discomfort, there will be no change, right? We are trying to undo years of socialization, and it's not going to happen overnight.
Yeah, and you bring up some great points, because I like that concept of brave, because very frequently, as you said, safe means that it's okay to share and that you're going to feel comfortable sharing if you want to, but you're not going to necessarily feel that obligation to
Right.
participate. And I think one of my favorite authors, and Brené Brown, that writes a lot of books
Oh,
talking
yes,
with,
we use some of her stuff in our materials, actually.
yeah, and she's terrific, and talks about that brave element, and the lack of shame of being able to express openly what you're doing, and kind of accept the gifts of your own imperfection. I love the concepts that she has, and I think it's so relevant to a lot of the groups that work in this space, because people come as a board, and as you said, it's very difficult for most organizations to really get all of their board members together at one time, and to get all of their attention, even if they're there, to make sure that they're not holding up their phones and looking at other stuff, and set the culture that tells them, like, hey, we're here, we need you for this day, this batch of time, whether it's 3 hours, 7 hours. But once you get it going, that time goes so quickly, because you are engaged. And I always find the groups that do a great job, and I know I've been at your training as well, that engagement is what makes that time go quickly, because you're not sitting there listening to Mary or someone else present for 3 hours or 7 hours, because nobody
Right.
wants that. I know when I taught at Northwestern in their sports management program, it was 2.5 hours. I'm not going to lecture for 2.5 hours.
Right.
And so we created dialogue and
Mm-hmm.
debates and opportunities for participation. And that's so hard. That's such a special skill. I know you do that very well. I'd love to have you share with our audience how you engage the board as you're doing these trainings.
Mm-hmm. Well, again, and that's interesting, because we do have to define sort of the group of folks we'll work with first. Is it board and staff, or is it just staff? Because what we know is that generally staff, because of the nature of the work in the nonprofit, are often much further out, if you will, in terms of understanding some of the concepts around diversity, equity, and inclusion work. And so most often, we will provide a training and assessment for those groups separately, so that the assessment, the board and staff would be included in either interviews or surveys, or both. But for the trainings, we usually do it separately, and we do it separately often because, again, this board is in a different place than the staff, and the board feels awkward about that. They don't necessarily want to have to do some of their learning in front of their staff members. And so, and we think, honestly, in many cases, it is best for them to be peer-to-peer in the space when we're doing those trainings. And so we will do the assessment. It generally is both board and staff together. We'll be able to pull out board responses versus staff responses and provide the data in that way. And then we also look at where they are in terms of level of information, the knowledge level and their familiarity with particular concepts and terms. And then we'll design the training for the board and the staff. And they may look a little different, and that's not unusual. Following a training, what we help organizations do is to start their DEI staff committee meeting, or I should say staff committee. And we help them through the first several rounds of meetings. We help them set up, with their agenda. We help them figure out who their co-chairs will be. We help them set the framework for an action plan, which is very, very important. And we will do something similar with the board as well. And again, the board's work will be rolled into whatever the staff are doing. However, we absolutely do have them work separately before we bring them together. And it is important that they come together and talk about what they've learned and how this work impacts the work of the organization. How do we gather around the mission of our organization by embedding these principles in our work moving forward? And so that's been the best approach that we, so far in terms of getting both board and staff up to speed.
You raised some great issues that occur in so many of the boards and organizations that I've been part of, which is that split between the expectations and the knowledge of the board and the staff. And the challenge is of getting that alignment, because each side is making decisions about what the other should do in too many organizations without understanding what the other side has as their starting point. I've been in a lot of places where you've got very experienced boards, high level people that have been around an organization for a long time. But in many nonprofits, the entry level positions are filled with relatively young and inexperienced individuals who don't have that same level of understanding of the nonprofit sector in general and of their own organization. And so they understand their job and their specific tasks, but they're not necessarily understanding all of the big picture issues that surround that and how their job impacts what goes on overall in the organization. And that's, sort of a little bit beyond the scope of what you're describing, but I think it's a challenge so many groups have, that as they bring those organizations together and bring all the stakeholders, how do they get that alignment?
Well, it's interesting you should say that, because we've had that raised as a concern in a number of organizations. And what I'm referring to is that we have an entirely new group of folks coming out of college into the workplace for the first time. And they've had no experience at all. Because I actually have hired very young people out of college, and they have been trained and they do an extraordinary job. However, they didn't come with that knowledge. I don't even know who teaches anymore how to, this is something really basic too, write a business letter, because business letters aren't really written like they used to be. And so someone may only have, for instance, experience using a CC in an email. And I've had that happen in my shop. Two of my colleagues we laugh about this story now, but when I said to them for the very first time, please do a letter to this particular person, we're going to need to do some of them hard copy, some of them in email, and I need you to put a CC on the hard copy. They really literally looked at me as though I had two heads. I mean, it was just, what are you talking about? And I said, have you really never done that? And they'd never done it. I mean, and it doesn't matter where you went to school. It's just not something that people are told or taught. And so we were in a workshop. I was in a workshop in Oak Park a few years ago, where a director of an organization, said to me that they were having concerns with their staff who they just hired a new group of folks, I think recent college graduates, and they were having trouble getting them to be at work on time. And so the executive director said, I'm just really thinking about changing our hours of operation. And I had to stop in my tracks and say, I don't know if I said this, but I was thinking this. Are you kidding? Because if someone comes to work for you, right, that is their wish, right? They've interviewed with you, you've hired them. Um, why? I said, why aren't they coming to work on time? Is it a child care issue? Is it a transportation issue? And she was like, no, I don't think it's any of those. They're just can't seem to get there at the start time. Well, I don't think we serve anyone well by saying, oh, we're just going to make our operating hours different now for you to make it more convenient for you. That doesn't make any sense in my mind, as opposed to making sure that you have the right people in the right positions in your organization, and that people understand that this is part of our contract. When you said you would work here, that meant that you were going to work within the guidelines of the hours of operation. And maybe it's not a good fit for you, but the idea that we would actually change our hours of operation for a new group of staff without any underlying causes was shocking to me. And so one of the things we've done is we put together a workshop. It's effective communications across generations. And I'm paraphrasing the title because we're tweaking it a bit. But essentially, it's how you work with people who have not had a lot of exposure to the workplace, are young in their careers. And I want to make sure I say young in career as opposed to they're of a young age. Sometimes those things are not connected at all. I actually have, had situations where people have been older and still haven't quite understood what's appropriate in the workplace. And so in these cases, it's folks though that are new to their careers coming out of college. And we have a workshop that we have put together to address this disconnect that we hear about often in nonprofits around the younger group of folks coming in, and then folks who are more established, who have been in their careers for a while. I mean, it runs the gamut, right, from 20s to the 60s, and just really how do we work together? How do we get folks to a place where they feel as though they know the position and they understand the expectations in the workplace?
It's interesting, as you described that, I was chuckling because if you were to go back and ask some of those young individuals working with you what CC stood for, I bet very few of them would be able to tell you that it was for carbon copy. They probably have no idea of what that stands for. And as you describe the hours, I think back to some interns that we've had and to some of the students we had at Northwestern. And I think that the challenge is, as you said, setting those expectations up front. It's unlikely that the work hours at the job changed from the time the individual interviewed until they needed to start working, right? So
exactly, right.
You know what you're buying into. And in today's world, the funny thing is most organizations are fairly accommodating of some form of flex hours.
That's exactly
if you
right.
just ask for it ahead of time and say, hey, does it make any difference if I come in and I work 10 to 7 instead of 8 to 5?
That's exactly right.
For many places, it's really not going to make a big difference. And
Right.
that communication issue is something that I've seen a lot of. How do you train that next wave, that next generation, not only on the accountability, which is what a lot of people focus on, but how do we teach them to advocate for themselves in the process of what's going on? And I think that bears a strong correlation into that DEI work that you're talking about, because in many organizations, there are people who come in different roles, and part of getting them the opportunities to advance is working with those individuals and helping train them that it's okay to stand up, right? You may need to push a little bit, because it doesn't matter what environment you're in a business sense, you're going to have to push to get further and further and get to the top. Now, if it's all white male organization, right, we're not going to notice the people who didn't advocate for themselves versus the ones that did, because they're all going to look the same at the end, right? They're all white males. But if we're bringing in now in a diverse group and you're not training people along the way, how to take those steps and how to advance their careers. Um, Talk a little bit about some of the workshops in the DEI space that you do.
Sure. Well, the first thing is we do something that is called, essentially the DEI 101 session, which is really an introduction, if you will, to some concepts around power and privilege and race. And one of our mantras, if you will, is that we are calling people in, not calling people out. And what we mean by that is, for us to do this work effectively, we know that we must be able to have a conversation with people. And we cannot do that if people feel shamed or that they've somehow or another been dismissed. And so it's really important that we call people into a conversation, and that at all costs we try to have a conversation, because at the end of the day, the conversation really is the relationship. And so our workshops are a combination of exercises that you do individually, in pairs, in small groups. They're very interactive. There is just a lot of different ways to learn, because we know people learn in many different ways. And so we want to make sure that we are giving as many opportunities for people to hear the information, to take the information in as we can. And so, that's one of the reasons why when you facilitate, you use both large group processes and you use small group processes. Some people will never, ever speak except in a large group. And then we have some folks that will speak in all the groups. And so we have to make sure that we have community agreements put into place, or group agreements, where we agree to how we're going to interact in this particular workshop, right? We're going to make space, take space is one of them, right? We're going to say what we have to say, but if we realize we've said too much or said a lot, we're going to make sure that someone else has the opportunity to also contribute. And that's also something we watch as a facilitator. If we see that some people are talking a little bit more than others, and other people are not talking at all, because as much as we can, we want to get full participation in the sessions. And so that's one workshop. We also do something on microaggressions, right? These seemingly small offenses that really can accumulate in someone's life and in the experiences that they have and their shared experiences, and get to the point where people just feel like, I just can't take anymore. I really, there's been so many things that have happened in my workplace, maybe on my commute to work, in a variety of ways. What are these small things that happen that people who are often the ones who perpetuate, I would say, these kinds of microaggressions don't even understand, nor in many cases are they intentionally being a particular way. However, what we know about this work is that intention versus impact is critical. And while we understand that you may not have intended it to be offensive, nonetheless, that is the impact. And so how are we going to resolve that now? Because that's what we have to deal with. And so we do so again, on microaggressions, we have a workshop that is particular for white folks. It's our white ally workshop, and we actually are probably going to change the name where there's lots of conversation going on around that right now. But it essentially is a workshop for white folks who really want to figure out, how am I more supportive? How do I get the information I need? Often what we know, or what we've seen, I should say, is that if you're a person of color in an organization, you are the person that is sought out to fix a number of things when they have something to do with race, as opposed to there being a partnership, for instance. For instance, when we set up a DEI staff committee, we will say that you really need to have a person of color and a white person co-chairing that committee. It's really important that we see that power dynamic modeled, because that's part of the work. And so we also train in the same way. We only do workshops where we have a multiracial team of facilitators. We think that's also very important. And so again, microaggressions, White Ally Workshop, DEI 101. We're introducing a new workshop this summer on class, because there is, of course, interconnectedness and intersectionality around race and class in this country, as there is around race, class, and gender. And so, again, we want to look at the work in many different ways. And as I said, the class workshop is a new one we'll be rolling out in the next month or so. Yeah.
I love that one on microaggressions, because I think that's one that's really challenging for most people to even recognize in themselves, right? If you look at how we all react. We always talk about body language and having close body language or different types of things. It's really hard if somebody is saying something that you don't like or that you find offensive to sort of sit there and have a completely neutral look. It's a skill that some people have been able to develop, but it's very hard, especially I think you talk about for younger employees, for people coming into the workplace that don't recognize how all of that comes together. And the concept of the co-chairs for the DEI committee, I think, is fantastic, because I see so often where people want to address those issues without involving, in a sense, both sides of the equation. So the diversity is not a white issue, so there shouldn't be anybody that's white on that committee, as opposed to recognizing that those people, may be very important voices, because just as you said, they may not understand some of the issues, and they need to be there and be educated so that they can be a voice within that workplace, within that organization, to help grow. I know you mentioned some of the other areas that you've done in terms of organizational development. Let's talk a little bit more about what types of workshops and programs you do there.
Sure. So under the umbrella of organizational development, we work with, and this is primarily nonprofits, around, it could be resource development. So we actually met in a workshop that I was facilitating at the Atchison Center for Nonprofit Management, which is part of North Park University here in Chicago. And we will do anything from how do you get your board excited about fundraising? Really important topic. One of my favorite topics, actually. I love talking about fundraising because it's exciting to see people get excited about it, and for people to realize that they have skills that they just assumed were non-existent with regard to fundraising. And so fundraising is a workshop that we do in terms of how board members can become better fundraisers and ambassadors for the organization. We also do workshops around how to be a board member, right? What are the roles and responsibilities of board members? You're supposed to show up at your board meeting. You're supposed to, if you have one, a give or get, right? You either give or you raise a certain amount of money every year. You're supposed to buy tickets to the special event. You're supposed to, participate on a task force or committee. So what are the roles and responsibilities of board members? What are the ones particular to your organization? Because they're not all the same. Some boards may meet once a month, some may meet 4 times a year, and everything in between. So we really talk to organizations about how you get your board members to a place where they feel engaged and there's peer-to-peer support. It's really difficult for a staff person, let's say the executive director, to go to their board and say, oh, you didn't do X, Y, and Z. No, that message is actually much better coming from another board person. At the end of the day, the staff person, and particularly the executive director or the CEO and president, they report to the board. And so we talk about all those kinds of things under that umbrella of organizational development. And really, it's really whatever it's going to do to make your organization be better, right? That idea of going from good to great, and what are the necessary steps to get you to that next level.
As you look at as we're recording this in the midst of the COVID crisis, you look at the challenges of raising money during this crisis, or really during any crisis. This one's a little different based on the geographic scope and the complexity of not having a time ending, as opposed to something like an earthquake or a hurricane or a tornado, where you have a sense of it's a discrete event and it's over. You may still need to raise money, but the threat isn't necessarily ongoing.
Right.
So,
nor is it economic necessarily.
Correct. And so now, as you look at what we're dealing with, how are you advising your organizations to proceed on a fundraising level in this time?
Well, it really varies on what you do, because while there's many organizations that are feeling the effects of not being able to fundraise, for instance, we're right in the middle of what would be considered the spring special event season. The luncheons, dinners, that would all be happening in April, May, into probably June, right? Because many people have a June 30th fiscal year end date. and they have these spring fundraisers to make sure they make their budget ending June 30th. We'll also see the same thing in the fall, where there'll also be another group of events that people always have in the fall. What we're contending with now in this new environment is that many people had an event in April, May, March even, May and into June, and they decided to go ahead and push it back until the fall. And what I am coming to terms with, just really as a result of hearing some of the news reports, and one of the things we'll be talking to some of our client partners about is not sure you're going to be able to do that event in the fall either. I mean, that's the reality. And I think what our government, first of all, we're, I think, very blessed to be here in Illinois, and I'm in Chicago in particular, because we have had just this extraordinary response to being proactive around the virus. And so what I believe part of the strategy is we'll just start letting this information seep out that, oh, you may not be able to go back to school in the fall. Now, apparently, Governor Pritzker said that. If he is saying be prepared for e-learning, that to me also means we need to be prepared that we will not be able to have an event as you had the last year, where you have 300 or 400, even 200 people in a room. And so the organizations that we think are doing well now are organizations that are providing human services, because everyone can see the need for them in a different way. Then maybe they can see the need for, you do adventure therapy trips for children. Really important. But what is the immediate need that people are seeing now? It's the same kind of response we see when there's any kind of a major disaster. For instance, the fires in Australia or an earthquake in Puerto Rico. When people can see that, it has an impact. That's why we often talk about your visuals are very important, right? What's going to reach people? What's going to have the greatest impact? Well, a picture does in fact say 1,000 words. And so people react to that very, very quickly. So if you're in a field, in an organization that does not do critical services right now, you're going to most likely see a decrease in the kind of fundraising, the dollars that you're getting in and the kind of fundraising that you can do. And so I think the strategy has to be on how will you continue to make sure your donors you've already had, those are the best ones to maintain, right? And to make sure you're taking care of them. Continue to understand the value of your work now in this new normal, because I don't know about you, Roy, but I don't think we're ever going back to the way things used to be. We're already hearing that social distancing will be in place throughout the summer. And so whatever used to be, I think is not going to necessarily be how we do things now. And thinking about that fundraiser that you used to have with a couple hundred people, I think you have to start to rethink about how you can do that in a different way.
Well, I know it's challenging to look at that fundraising calendar you described, this spring event. So everybody, I think, as soon as this started, within a couple of weeks, almost everybody understood any events scheduled April, May, June are not going to really happen. And then the question became, how far back do we push them? Do we push it, just skip this year and we'll go to next year?
Right. Mm-hmm.
Do we do a virtualized event, which still has unproven track records and technologies in terms of how much engagement you can create and how much money you can raise, especially for what I'm going to describe as the small and middle level size organizations? I think some of the larger national types of nonprofits can still use those technologies and virtual platforms and still do pretty well, maybe not as well. But I think for the small groups, it's really challenging to get people to come and participate. I think that when you look at the fall, as you described, my concern, and I wrote this in an article for the team marketing report, is you look at that fall calendar and you already had a lot of events scheduled in the fall, because that's a really busy time of year, September, October, November. And now you're going to take and add on top of that all of these events that got deferred from the spring season to the fall season, and try and find where you can sneak in and where you can put your own event there. And as you said, there's no guarantees that those events are going to be permissible on those dates. I think we're going to see things opening up. I think people are going to be allowed to go out. We're going to have limited scope of going back to work. But I do not believe that we're going to see fans at sporting events for the rest of 2020.
Oh, I agree.
I don't think that's going to happen. And so somewhere between the scale of we can have a gathering of 10 people, but we can't have 20,000 to 80,000 at a sporting event.
Exactly.
Somewhere in there will be space for, I think, small group gatherings, but I think a lot of people are going to be leery of getting together. And so even though you may technically be allowed to have a gathering up to 25 or 50, I don't know what the appetite is going to be for people until they feel comfortable going out, and you're going to really be hit and miss from a donor side.
Absolutely. I think that's absolutely true. And it reminds me that we are working with a group where we just helped them move their event back to the fall. We did this probably well over a month ago. And here's the thing I think people have to keep in mind is that it changes every week, if not sometimes every day. But certainly for this kind of event planning, it's a very different time right now than it was a month ago when we moved the event from July to October. Because at that time, we thought our peak in Illinois was going to be in April. And now we are hearing, and we know because of our extended stay-at-home orders, that our peak won't be until mid-May. And if the idea is that you've had 2 weeks of decreasing numbers in terms of infection rates and all that, and that they want you to have that before you think about lifting up some of your stay-at-home orders, that clearly gets us into early June. And
Right.
So to your point, I'm now thinking, as I was just thinking about all this before our call, but also I have a podcast I'm doing tomorrow. And I'm thinking that it really, the best of all worlds is, can you just put your event into next year? Because by that time we will have gone through the wave again, because what we're hearing now is that we will be visiting, this will be back with us in the fall.
Yeah.
I think, if we're not, handling it in a particular manner, we don't want to go back to this place in the fall. And so how do we minimize that? We minimize that by not having these large scale functions. And so I think for people that have just said, we're not doing it this year at all, they may be in the best possible place than those organizations that said, oh, we're going to take it out of May or June and put it in November. I think that there will still be a concern. Yeah.
Well, I know you've given us some incredible information. We've got a couple minutes left here, so I want to utilize our sports philanthropy superpowers, and I want to give you the option to appoint yourself as commissioner of one sport. Tell us what sport that's going to be.
It's going to be volleyball.
Volleyball. Okay. And what's your first act as a commissioner of volleyball?
I'm going to probably change the uniforms because I don't understand really why it's important for women to play in those uniforms. I mean, I love volleyball. I played it off and on all my life, but I certainly started playing when I was in high school. The other one I would have said, by the way, would have been basketball, because I'm 6 feet tall. So I absolutely played basketball. But I would probably change the clothing. I think it's something that I often hear young women who are being introduced to the sport, their parents are saying, well, and why are they wearing that outfit? And I'm like, I don't know. I guess it helps them move faster. Not quite sure that matters. And so I would want to change the outfit most likely. But love volleyball, and we'll be really happy when we can go back to playing some.
Oh, it'd be great when we can get back out and play sports. And
Yes.
Mary, I appreciate you sharing all of your insight with us today. I think you've given people some great items to consider, and as they look at how to build the strength of their organization. And I encourage our listeners to reach out. You'll be able to see all the information about Mary and about Morten Group on the page that we have for the podcast. So we thank you for tuning in. Mary, thank you again for joining us.
Thank you so much. And thanks for all of your work, Roy. Really appreciate it.
And thank you to our listeners for being with us. And we look forward to seeing you on the next edition of the Sports Philanthropy Podcast. Thank you.